Welcome everyone to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO, and I'm also a composer as a part of today's panel. For those that don't know YIVO, it's a wonderful place for the contemplation, the celebration of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have an archive and a library with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which researchers from around the world use for their work. In addition to making these materials available, we do a variety of educational initiatives, exhibitions, and public programs like this one to bring the stories and the culture that is celebrated within out to a wider audience. So thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have today's discussion, which is going to be led by Professor Neil W. Levin, who is the Anne E. Leibovitz Visiting Professor in Residence in Music. Neil is the Artistic Director and Editor-in-Chief of the Milken Archive of Jewish Music, and he's also Professor Emeritus of Jewish Music at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. We're really lucky to have Neil leading this conversation on the Jewish experience in opera. And joining us for today's panel, we have composers Ofer Ben-Amots, Bruce Adolphe, David Schiff, myself, composer Alex Weiser, and librettist Ben Kaplan, who is also the Director of Education at YIVO. So it's a real nice family event today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Neil, who's going to be leading today's conversation. Neil, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Alex. So we're talking about opera of Jewish experience, or opera of Jewish connection, or opera of Jewish substance, Jewishly related opera, and so on. And in fact, this usually surprises people when I tell them this. There are dozens upon dozens of first-rate such operas written over the past 110 years or so, but almost nobody knows about them. Only two operas of Jewish experience or substance have entered what we call the canon, the operatic canon, by which we mean the vast repertoire of this Western American, Western musical genre that we call opera, about which any aficionado of opera would know. If not know the opera, know about it. Only two such operas, and we all know what they are. They're Jacques Fromental Halevi's La Juive, the Jewess, which is from the 1840s in Paris, although this is a topic for a symposium all in itself. One could argue that it is as much, if not more, French opera than Jewishly connected opera, but we'll let it go. And the other, of course, is Arnold Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron. Of all the others, it really isn't fair to expect even ardent opera fans to know about most, in fact, sometimes any of them. So this whole subject is, I would say, one of music's best kept secrets, which we will attempt to begin revealing this evening. Which brings us to our reviewing for ourselves, among ourselves, and for our audience. Well, what is it we mean by Jewishly related, or an opera of Jewish substance or experience? And assuming that we're not talking about some imaginary peripheries, but the core, it's not very complicated. It's really three things. One, an opera that is based or drawn on Jewish literature, sacred or secular, so that covers us, religious subjects or fiction, whatever, but Jewish literature. Two, an opera drawn on an aspect or an episode of specifically Jewish history and told from Jewish perspectives or angles or sensibilities. And the third is Jewish folklore or Jewish legends, or some combination of all of them. But I think the most important thing is the intention of the composer and the librettist, and also the perspective that is traditionally Judaic or Jewish if we're speaking of something secular. Which brings us to the equally important matter of what we do not mean, which can forestall a lot of questions. We do not mean operas drawn on the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, which is very different from the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible, because the Old Testament is the appropriate foundation for and background to the New Testament of Christian theology. So dozens and dozens of operas going back to the 17th century that are biblical operas are all drawn from those sources. All the way up through Verdi, Nabucco, no. Samson and Delilah, no. Rossini's Moses, no. Equally, we don't mean operas drawn from the Apocrypha with non-Jewish perspectives. So that would include not only all the many Deborah operas and Judith operas, although some are, and maybe a dozen or more Maccabees operas, the most famous of which, of course, is, I think you'll agree with me, the most famous is Anton Rubinstein's The Maccabees in German. But, you know, the libretto at the end says now that the Maccabees have been victorious, the way is paved for the second coming of the Christian Savior. So, which is perfectly appropriate for a Christian composer. So we don't mean that. We certainly don't mean any opera that has a coincidental character who happens to be Jewish. And the best example that comes to mind is Mascagni's L'Amico Fritz, where there's a character, Rabbi David. It has nothing to do with the opera, has nothing to do with the story and so forth. And finally, we certainly do not mean any opera whose purpose is to justify the murder of Jews or to explore the sensitivities and sensibilities of the murderers of Jews as Jews. And you all know what opera about which I'm speaking. But beyond that, I think definitions are useless. I think we should take the caution of Albert Einstein, who said, not everything that counts can be counted. And not everything that can be counted counts. And if you want, we could even go further to Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart's comment on a completely unrelated matter, but where he said that he could not intelligibly succeed in defining something, but, quote, I know it when I see it. So we have among our little group this evening creators of operas, 3 operas on Jewish literature, 3 on Jewish history, and we'll see how additional elements such as Jewish folklore or legend fit in without being mutually exclusive to any of those. So I'd like to begin by asking each of you to just give us, for starters, a one mouthful sentence, if you wish, of what your opera is about, and then we'll come back to it. So, for example, Ofer, you've written 2 operas on drawn upon Jewish literature. Interestingly enough, one both in a way from Yiddish literature, but actually one from Hebrew literature. And you'll explain that to us a little bit later. But let's start with the first one, A Fool's Paradise. What's that about? That's an Isaac Bashevis Singer story. So obviously anyone would know that that is Jewish literature. What's the opera about?
Okay. Fool's Paradise is a tiny story, maybe 4 pages. And when I read it, I immediately envisioned an opera. I never thought before, I'd never thought I'd write an opera because I really never liked operas too much. So, but when I read this one, I could see immediately what's going on the stage. And it's a funny story about a delusional young man who remembers his nanny telling him about paradise. But you know, paradise in the Talmudic sense, Gan Eden. And he eats from the whale and he eats from the bison and he sits with all the Lamed Vav Tzadikim in Gan Eden. So now he's 20, he's about to get married, but he works in his father's business, and he's just tired of life. He wants to go straight to Gan Eden, straight to paradise. And of course, this is only a delusion. So the Dr. Yoetz tells, we need a makeup kind of paradise to make in his room, pretend that they're all the angels, give him the food that he wants until he's being cured. And it's a funny story. He finds himself and he thinks that he's in heaven. He is now dead, but then the food is the same all the time. The singing of the angels is the same. He gets bored. And then he said, I want to leave. I want to go back to life. And that's the happy ending. And he gets married with Achsa, his fiancée. So it's just a funny.
You used the term delusion. And that's interesting because I see, but as we go through this, I see a common thread in all your operas because I'm familiar with them. I mean, actually, that opera, I haven't seen the production because it was actually done in a German translation. We should tell everybody in Zurich, but I've heard all the others at the premieres actually, and there seems to be a common thread of delusion, or in at least some cases, the psychobabble of quote being in denial, and we'll see how that runs through. Your other opera is, of course, on the I think it's safe to say the single most famous serious Yiddish play of all time, the Dybbuk. But of course, it was originally written in Russian. It was only translated into Yiddish for the Vilna Truppe to do it in Yiddish, which was in 1920. But you chose to do it from a different source.
Well, I chose the Hebrew, and that's because I'm Israeli. And Hebrew means a lot to me. I mean, the rhythm of Hebrew, the beauty of the language. It's not easy to write an opera. Hebrew is not Italian. Hebrew sounds like two people really fighting with, with each other with hammers or something like that. But the story, I started it actually as a incidental music for theater. And the funny thing about this Dybbuk is that the director wanted to create a no-Japanese style theater. And he asked me to write the music in a no-Japanese court music style, which is very foreign to me. And I wrote this Jewish stuff. He didn't like it, but it was a success. It was many, many times, 15 times in Tel Aviv. And the result, I said to him, let's make an opera. And he said, no way. And I said, okay, I have to write then my own libretto. And that caused the entire.
That's how it happened. But when you did your libretto, as I understand it, you did it not from a translation that was a substitute, but from a translation that actually is a work of art all in itself, which is what Bialik's translation.
The Bialik translation to a Dybbuk of Ansky is a masterpiece. It's a Hebrew masterpiece. It's a literary and poetic masterpiece. I didn't change one single word. I just changed the order of things.
Yes, the Bialik. So that's an interesting thing because, all of us should be aware, so far I've uncovered 14 operas on the Dybbuk in 5 languages. But I think yours is the first in Hebrew. And not just in Hebrew, but to use the Bialik, it really shouldn't be called a translation, it should be called a version, actually. Wouldn't you agree? Because it's a work of art in itself. It isn't a substitute. And in fact, that was premiered in 1926 when Habima was on tour in residence in Weimar, Germany. And I don't know if you know this, but the next morning, one of the chief music critic for one of Berlin's major newspapers wrote the following. I mean, I didn't make a point of memorizing this. I just can't forget it when I read it. He said, of course, I couldn't understand one word of it, but I could tell that this must have been the elegant Hebrew in which God must have spoken to the ancient Israelites when he was in his best mood. And so that's, in some substance, makes your opera, because Shulamit Ran, who we wanted to be with us tonight, wasn't able to, was commissioned to write an opera on the Dybbuk, but in the 1990s was a major success, but that's in English. Others are in English. One, at least, is in Italian and so forth. And we'll talk a bit about what the delusion is there, but let's go to David. David, you have also, your opera is also on an Isaac Bashevis Singer story, but a different one. Probably, I'm guessing, but I think at the time you wrote the opera, you could say that that was his most famous story, Gimpel the Fool.
Yes, let me tell you a little bit about how it came into being. I was in my final semester for a master's degree at Manhattan School of Music, and I was taking a course with Nicholas Flagello in opera composition, and we were asked to write a libretto. And at the same time, I actually was teaching a literature class at Hebrew Union College, where I also taught music theory. I did a lot of things down there. And I was just hearing a lot about Isaac Bashevis Singer. I'd never read him. And because I was teaching this literature course, I put it on the syllabus. I put Gimpel the Fool on the syllabus. So I was reading it. So when I got this assignment from Nicholas Flagello, I immediately thought, I'll make a libretto from Gimpel the Fool. And then just because I'm perverse, I said, you know, Stravinsky wrote an opera in Latin. I'm going to write an opera in Yiddish, because I knew that the original of Gimpel was in Yiddish, and then it was translated by Saul Bellow. And then a lot happened after that. The first thing I had to do was get the Yiddish text. We had a wonderful time because my grandparents all spoke Yiddish, didn't speak English. And my maternal grandfather, Benjamin Meisner, was in the hospital. And every weekend, his son, my uncle, would come to see him and would read to him from the forward. But when I was working on this project, he brought the Yiddish version of Gimpel the Fool and read it to my grandfather. And this was very helpful because my grandfather was from Warsaw and he had been a baker's apprentice. And Gimpel is the story of a baker. And there are a lot of words in the Yiddish which you won't find in a Yiddish dictionary because they're only things that bakers know. There's some kind of pot that you put dough in to rise. There's a word for that. What I discovered from the Yiddish, which, as I said, you know, it started out Stravinsky doing Latin, I'm going to do Yiddish. But when I actually found the Yiddish, I discovered that Gimpel in Yiddish was completely different from Saul Bellow's translation. That Saul Bellow, as far as I was concerned, had weakened it. He had taken all the flavor out of it. It was much more colorful, much more upsetting. And the most upsetting line, which I made a point of putting in the opera and always got a gasp from the audience, well, it's central to the plot. So let me tell you the story of Gimpel the Fool. He's a baker. He's a very strong man. He's the baker in the shtetl of Frampol. But from early childhood, he's very gullible. He's predisposed to believe what people say. And so everybody in town takes advantage of him. And after, when he's a kid, there's a whole catalog of all the tricks they pull on him. And just because he will believe anything they say. And finally, they find out the perfect use for his gullibility. They marry him to this woman who lives at the edge of town, Elka, who's actually the town whore. And it's a very nice arrangement for the town because they continue to see her and he never touches her, but she has many children. And he, because he's gullible and about a lot of things, makes the assumption that they're his kids. And at one point, he goes to the rabbi because it doesn't quite feel right. There's something weird going on. And in the Yiddish, but not in the Hebrew, Gimpel says to himself, after all, they said Jesus didn't have a father either. Okay, I thought it was very interesting that Bella left that out because it's like a punch. So that's the lucky thing that happened to me is that I had this idea for a class, but then I mentioned it to Lawrence Avery, the great cantor, who was the cantor of my parents' congregation, Bethel in New Rochelle. And he said, oh, that's wonderful. We're having a Yiddish weekend in the fall featuring Irving Howe, who's going to speak about Yiddish literature and things like that. And so he said, why don't you put something together? And so the original Gimpel was performed in the autumn of 1975 at Bethel at this Yiddish weekend. And because I was teaching at Hebrew Union College, I was able to put together a company from my students. And Avery sang the role of the rabbi. And Gimpel just grew from there on. I had grown up with musical theater, but not opera. My favorite operas were Wozzeck and Pelléas. You won't find much of them in Gimpel, but those are the operas I knew, not the opera lovers' typical operas.
Let me ask you, when you completed, when you were working on this, when you completed it, and I was there at the premiere, and then I was there, it was so successful that it was done the following year at the, we should tell everybody, at the Jewish Opera at the Y program. But were you aware that there hadn't been a Yiddish opera written for many, many decades?
I didn't know this. I mean, I found out a lot of things. There actually was an opera of Gimpel the Fool by Charles Davidson that predated from 1965, but it's in English.
No, I'm talking about in Yiddish.
Right. But no, I had no idea of what I was wading into and whether this had been done before. I just came up with this idea and pursued it. But part of it was because I had grown up in this family where all my grandparents spoke Yiddish. My parents only spoke this kind of first generation Yiddish where they spoke to each other. They spoke to their parents in Yiddish and they spoke to each other to keep secrets from us. I didn't speak Yiddish at all. But my grandparents also never talked about where they came from. They never, and when I was a kid, 1959, my family, through circumstances, spent the entire summer in Europe. And we told my father's mother, Grandma, we're going to Europe this summer. And she said, why would you want to go there?
Yeah, that was a very common thing.
Right. And that was, so when I read Singer, it was like this was opening the door to my grandparents' world, which they refused to talk about. And so that's why I was so excited to work with this material.
Now you found a way, well, we'll come back to that in a moment. I'm going to talk about some of the other operas, but you found a way to make the opera intelligible to an audience that didn't know one word of Yiddish. And we'll come back to that because I can think of only a few operas in Yiddish, true grand operas. I mean, the very first one ever was 1912, King Ahaz by Samuel Ullman in London, totally forgotten. And then during the 1920s, Henoch Cohen wrote at least one, and Milner wrote one, at least one in the early 1920s in Russian. So, but this was a really unusual, quote unquote, what they used to call a happening when Gimpel was premiered. And of course, it's filled with delusion. I mean, that's what it's all about. But then the question is, and I don't have an answer. I ended an article I wrote once about it. I said, the question is not whether Gimpel was a fool or not, but did Isaac Bashevis Singer know whether he was a fool or not? It still stands as a landmark in opera and in terms of its Yiddish portrayal. Bruce, You had two operas premiered at the Jewish Opera at the Y program in the well, by that time it was early 1980s, right?
1980s, yes.
Yeah. So the first one, and I was there at the premiere, was Mikhoyels The Wise. Tell us just in a sentence, what's that all about? And then we'll go to the next one.
Well, Mikhoyels The Wise is a true story of Solomon Mikhoyels, who was a great actor who acted in Yiddish in the Soviet Union, well, in Russia and then the Soviet Union, and he was very famous for his King Lear. He became also basically the spokesperson for Jewish culture and also for Stalin, because he believed in what Stalin was doing, like everybody else, speaking of delusion. And he eventually his assassination was ordered by Stalin, and his tongue was cut out as a symbol of the end of Yiddish language and Jewish culture. So it's the story of Solomon Mikhoyels, and some other great people appear in it briefly. Like,
and I would just add, not only is it a true story, but Solomon Mikhoyels was probably the greatest serious Yiddish actor of his generation in the entire world. And he was the de facto spokesman of Soviet Jewry.
Right.
So it was quite a revealing opera, because Mikhoyels, during the war, was together with Itzik Pfeffer, who was also murdered with all of the Jewish poets, because Stalin, we now know, had planned to finish off Hitler's work after, had he not died or been murdered, we'll never know which. Mikhoyels came to New York on behalf of the Soviet Union during the war.
That scene, of course, is in the opera.
You have that in the opera. You have that wonderful scene.
There's a scene where Mikhoyels comes to speak, and actually Paul Robeson and Charlie Chaplin were there. And in the opera, you know, I had to go look at this because the 1980s is a long time ago, but I looked at that scene and I remembered we do have Charlie Chaplin. He does sing, you know, he appears, and Mikhoyels, of course, is most of it. And Paul Robeson does sing in the opera, but I had forgotten what happened, which was that we decided to do that and the budget was no longer movable, and they wouldn't let us get an African-American singer to be Paul Robeson. So we had him on a telephone hookup with a projection of Robeson's face, and the bass who sings another part, the part of Denister, was backstage singing the part of Paul Robeson as if it were over the telephone.
Yeah, I remember that. It was very effective because Stalin thought that the rally was at the Polo Grounds in New York in 1943. And Mikhoyels spoke, and you did a marvelous job of that in the opera of the portrayal. But you know, the delusion was all the way around. It was two-sided, because the delusion there was one that has happened many times in history. Stalin assumed that the American Jews had a tremendous affinity for communism, because there were a very small number in these Yiddish choruses that were far left and some outright communist, and they were all near the Polo Grounds, and that they could influence President Roosevelt to open a second front. So I remember that, but then of course you carried all the way, and the opera really is about the death of Yiddish and Jewish culture in the Soviet Union. Now, then you did another one, was it 1 year later?
1 year later.
False Messiah. Tell us about that.
The False Messiah is the story of Shabbtai Zvi. And of course, Shabbtai Zvi proclaimed himself the Messiah in 1666 and had millions of followers. But when he got to Constantinople, he was arrested, and the Sultan of Turkey gave him a choice of either converting to Islam or basically being killed to show that he was the Messiah and then wouldn't die if they did some elaborate. In the opera, he would have been shot with 1,000 arrows. There are many different versions of that, although it's a true story. And of course, he converted to Islam. So it's kind of a downer for his followers, to put it mildly. And a lot of them also converted to Islam. And to this day, there are people in Turkey who are Shabbtaians. They're Jewish at night or on the weekends, and they're Islamic in the day in the normal culture. And the librettist, Mel Gordon, actually flew to Turkey before this opera got started, because it was one of his fascinations. And
this was a tremendous lesson in Jewish history for those who don't know it. In other words, your opera was. I remember that because
my relatives.
You talked about
some of my relatives were very, very upset that I wrote the story of Shabbtai Zvi. Some of them were outraged
because it was embarrassing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but the fact is, any first-year history course in Jewish history survey is going to address that whole century of the false messiahs, of which Shabbtai Zvi was only the most famous. There were dozens of them. The greatest charlatan of all was Jacob Frank, who came afterwards. Yeah. But the point is that here's another delusion. We can explain the reason for the delusions, but when you say that millions of people or hundreds of thousands of Jews followed him, we should add, this included thousands of wealthy Jewish businessmen and educated people, both secular education and Jewish education, who were induced to liquidate all their holdings and follow him, believing he was the Messiah.
He must have been very convincing. And one of the things that's interesting about it from an operatic point of view is that apparently in real life, or it seems, especially according to Gershom Sholem, who wrote the great book on him, that he was a great singer and he sang his sermons. And of course, in an opera, since everybody's singing, it's a little tricky, but I think we pulled that off.
All right, and now,
unusual range.
Let me ask the team, because we're lucky we have the librettist here, Ben, and the composer. Your opera, State of the Jews. In a nutshell, because we'll come back to it, what's it about? Ben? Alex?
Sure. So State of the Jews is based on the true story of Theodor Herzl, who's the founder of modern Zionism. And it focuses on the last year of his life as he struggles to find a homeland for the Jewish people. And it intersects that story with the story of Julie Herzl, who was Herzl's wife, and really shows a more intimate portrait of their family life and the costs of his political activities on them personally. It's a very tragic personal story. And we really set out to engage with these, Herzl's being such an iconic figure in Jewish history. And there's the image of Herzl, the legend of Herzl, but there also was an actual person, a human being that many people didn't really know about some of the details of his life. But the more we wrote the opera, we realized how important Julie was to this story. And she actually becomes very central to the piece and to the musical structure. Also, Alex, I know you'll probably want to say something about that.
In as much as if I recall, Julie represents the so-called optimistic view for a future of Jewry in Europe, in German-speaking Europe, in Vienna, and so forth. That is the paradise and so forth. So I would automatically say, here's another delusion. And there might even be a second delusion, but we can't know because Herzl died so young. Because Herzl didn't envision that there would be any Arab resistance, the indigenous Arab population, that their tormentors were the Ottoman Turks, which is historically fact. And therefore he never ever came up with the even notion that we would need a Jewish army or an army in that area. I suppose you could call that a bit of a delusion as well. But the two of you worked together from the very beginning on this opera, right? I mean, you didn't just write a libretto and then hand it over and say, all right, go to it, which sometimes does happen.
If only it were so easy.
But you worked as a team from the beginning.
Definitely,
right? Yeah. Okay, now this brings us to an interesting question, which any of you could speak to. In opera in general, it's the music that makes it Italian opera or French opera or German opera or whatever, right? So for example, Verdi's La Traviata takes place in France, but nobody would say it's French opera, it's Italian opera. And it's not only that it takes place in France, the sensibilities of the story are very French and so forth. Aida, nobody would say it's Egyptian opera, it's Italian opera. Masked Ball, Sweden, or if one went with what the censors demanded for a while in Boston, nobody would say it's Swedish opera or a Bostonian or American opera, it's Italian opera. Meyerbeer, in French opera, L'Africaine, nobody would say it's African opera, it's French opera. Puccini, Girl of the Golden West, takes place in California in the gold rush. Nobody would say that that is even secondarily American opera. It's purely Italian opera. But when we come to our subject, it seems to me it's almost the other way around. It doesn't matter what the musical style is. What matters is what the plot is, what the story is, what the setting is. And let's see what we come up with. What do you think about that? Anybody?
Well, I think there are, obviously there are a lot of different ways of doing it. I was very conscious of this. I just in terms of I wanted to sort of impose certain limitations on myself. But so I was very conscious that the sources of Gimpel, the harmonic language and the melodic language, were two things. The melodic language came out of the music of the synagogue, and Torah trope, Haftorah trope, and because from the synagogue that I grew up in with this great cantor, so that was very much in my ears. And then I was also, this was in the mid 1970s, it was around the time of the klezmer revival. I had not grown up listening to klezmer music because nobody called it that. We called it Jewish music. And of course, my family listened to that on WEVD in New York, the Yiddish station. That was on every Sunday morning in our house. I was never listening to it, but it got into me because I found when I started composing, it just gushed right out of me.
Okay, so David, let's hear 1 minute. Can you play us 1 minute of and then we'll see how it contrasts, because every one of the operas written by this group is equally an opera of Jewish substance. But let's hear 1 minute of the music from Gimpel.
So if I can introduce this is what I call the bread song. It was actually, I added it to the opera for its second production in 1980 at the Y, because I thought, in musicals, there's always a who am I number. And I figured Gimpel is a baker, so we should see how he thinks about himself as a baker. And so this is, I wrote the words for this, they're all names of breads and cakes. So he's talking about the things he makes in the bakery.
Right.
Okay.
Bin zu Revier geworden gegangen. Und gelachen, was hab noch gekannt. Da ein Stück Kuchen, dort na Macaroni.
Wonderful. Now, I think I'm going to ask Alex, and you'll see why. Play me your 1 minute from State of the Jews.
All right, just give me a second here. I actually have a video. We can just watch 1 minute together.
As long as we can hear it.
Yes.
Because it's
here. All right.
Okay, I remember that. Bruce, we don't have any recording yet of Shabbtai Zvi, but we have one lovely excerpt from Mikhoyels The Wise. So let's hear a minute of that.
All right, this is from a very strange scene because it takes place in Birobidzhan, which was another educational moment. It's,
Yeah, I think we have to explain that Birobidzhan was an attempt in the Soviet Union to be an alternative to Zionism, a Jewish autonomous state.
Right.
And to this day, I mean, it just never got off the ground.
Well, there were a lot of murders there.
There were a lot, and in fact,
Stalin purged a lot of people.
yeah.
look,
I'm told that the street signs are still in Yiddish there.
Right, and Yiddish was the language, and Jews didn't want to move there. I mean, some did. And when Mikhoyels came to the Polo Grounds, he tried to convince Jews to come from New York to Birobidzhan, and some did actually. Anyway, in this scene, Mikhoyels arrives at Birobidzhan, and he meets a telegraph operator who is actually Korean, which makes sense because this is right on the border of Manchuria, and there were Koreans and Japanese and Chinese people involved in some battles going on, and it was a very strenuous, difficult time. Anyway, he meets Sincha. She speaks Yiddish, although the opera's in English. David, you can figure that out later. And basically, she's trying to convince him to stay in Birobidzhan, and he's trying to figure out who is this Korean who speaks Yiddish. If we only hear a minute, it might be a confusing bit of script, but
yeah, but it's very beautiful. That's what counts.
Thank you.
Shalem, you look very un-Jewish in the light of the lamppost.
Yes, I am a Korean from Vladivostok, the port of refuge, Vladivostok.
And I am Solomon Mikhoyels from Moscow and Riga.
My name is Sincha.
What a beautiful name, a strange name, and yet you know Yiddish.
We're not a god.
Yeah, that brings back a lot of memories. Ofer, I think, why don't you play us just from the Dybbuk, 1 minute from the Dybbuk.
Okay, I'll share here a video. One minute, let's see. So just to describe, this is the moment where the rabbi is exercising the Dybbuk out of Leah, and this is pretty much the climax of it. Dybbuk come out, and Dybbuk doesn't want to come out. So let's see.
Of the exorcism.
The exorcism. Can you see the video here?
Yes.
Okay.
Dybbuk, הואיל ולא קיבלת את עזרתי, הריני מוסר אותך לרשותם של כוחות העליונים. ואילו כן, באוהב הגדול, באוהבך, הגיע.
אל תגרשוני. לא
Okay, that's
And I think we should just mention that we had planned to have the New York premiere of the Dybbuk, of Ofer's Dybbuk. When was it, Alex? A year ago. Yeah.
Yep.
A year ago.
Just about a year ago, almost
About a
to
year
the
ago.
day, actually.
So most of the day that had to be canceled, but we're going to make every effort to do it, let's say, a year from now. The New York premiere, because it had many other premieres. And the reason I think is clear. We have all these opposing, in a way, musical languages, but they're all in the service of Jewish substance in an opera. Which brings me to the next thing that any of you, or maybe all of you, would like to address, which is the issue of universality. So, all great literature may be primarily one ethnic tradition or another, but it's going to have, by virtue of its greatness, it's going to have universality, and the same thing is probably true of every one of the plots in your operas. But as you know, the rage for the past, I don't know, 30, 40 years, maybe longer, has gotten, in some respects, sillier and sillier, but it's a matter of opinion, has been to restage an opera in a different time and different place, but not change one note of the music or one word of the opera. So, of course, I guess the most glaring example of that, not all that long ago, was at the Met, Rigoletto, taking place in Las Vegas. You all remember that. Actually, New York City Opera did one longer ago than that, a Rigoletto that took place on Mulberry Street in New York, in Little Italy. They did a Traviata that took place in New York in a hospital ward. Then, of course, there's the famous case of Chirot, who did the entire Wagner Ring cycle in a nuclear power plant and all that sort of thing. Some people say some of these work, some say they don't. Could you see any of your operas being restaged in that way without changing a note of the music or the words?
No, Neil, those are operas that are fairly old established repertoires. So, people are trying to put a new spin on it to bring a different kind of audience. You don't want to put a new spin on a work that people hardly know or that's new. So, I mean, putting a spin on a classic is fine. It's like Shakespeare. People do Shakespeare in every which way and nothing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Merchant of Venice, for example, with Al Pacino, what was it, 10, 12 years ago? I don't remember. Took place in the London Stock Exchange in the 19th century. Did it work? Yeah, it probably worked. But like, I'm not inserting myself into this because I don't go for any of them. I mean,
I don't think it's likely to happen that a new work or a relatively new work is going to get treated as if it were an old masterpiece that needs restaging. It's probably just not going to happen.
I think that's a very valid point, but I'm not only asking, what about 100 years from today? In other words, is it possible? For example, would it work? And I'm not promoting it, but I don't promote it for any opera.
I would say, I would look at this a little differently, that I worked with a number of directors. They were all very good. And a director has a role, a very important role in a production of an opera. And I think as a composer, I learned to step back and let the director have their say in what was going on. And the only instruction I gave, and again, where does Gimpel take place? Well, doesn't exist anymore. We're imagining it. The only instruction I always gave to my directors, I said, please, I don't want it ever to look like Fiddler. Okay.
Bravo.
So we're not in Chagall land. Okay. We're in, I want something that's closer to the feeling of life as it was. And then I left it to them. Could you do Gimpel in Rockland County? Probably. I don't think it would gain very much that way. But in terms of having a visual experience in the opera and placing the music in a space, that's crucial to any operatic production. And I really admire directors who can listen to the music and then take it somewhere visually, which I can't do.
Ben,
You're lucky.
What
I just
about?
want to,
Yeah.
if I can say to David that, one beautiful thing about Gimpel is that the story, it's not a true story, and he wasn't a real person. So
Right.
you can set it anywhere, and you could actually possibly benefit from putting it even on another planet one day. And I'm sure Neil, in 100 years, that's very likely. But for something like Mikhoyels, which was an actual true person in the
Right.
Soviet Union, there's nothing you can do with that other than be creative in how you stage. And we did have some remarkable staging and sets, but they have to be about.
I mean, of course, when it comes to Shabbtai Zvi, there are plenty of false messiahs in every generation, in every country of the world, and you could probably do that, although then we'd be giving up a good lesson in Jewish history. What do you think about Herzl, Alex, Ben?
Well, I mean, I think, one of the things about the story that I find so compelling is how, even though it's a totally true story, it's become a kind of mythology. And so, I totally agree with what Bruce said. You want everyone to get to know the piece as he meant it first. But in 100 years, if it's, with, Bezras Hashem, it's a very well-known piece and it's been done tons of times. I could absolutely see it in a different context to try to find something new in it. To highlight this other kind of element that.
I mean, I'm talking about, of course, the more I think of it, one could come and say, look, change it to another time and place with another national leader trying to restore a national sovereignty. But on the other hand, it is sui generis in all history.
I have to say that when you say 100 years, it sounds like a long time, but my operas we're talking about were 40 years ago.
Yeah, that's true. All right.
I was in my 20s.
For 16 more years, you'll be ready, Bruce.
Just wait around, Bruce. Just wait a little bit.
So let me ask you all this. Do you have in mind, either for yourself or for other composers, other subjects of Jewish substance that you consider to be operatic by nature and begging for an opera to be written? I'd like to hear from each one of you, and then I'll give you the correct answers. Which, in other words, I'll give you my list. But in all seriousness, there are hundreds of subjects in all three categories: Jewish history, Jewish literature, Jewish folklore, that are suitable and in some cases cry out, and in other cases they may not be suitable. I mean, I've picked subjects for Hugo Weisskopf, for example, where he read it, a Tolstoy story. He came back the next day, he said, Neil, it's a wonderful story, I never read it, but it doesn't have our operatic possibilities. And he explained, and he was 100% right. But there are some that do. So let's start. What things do you think that either you'd like to do or you'd like to be to see done? Anybody? Bruce?
Well, okay. There was, I was thinking of writing an opera about Joachim Prinz, the rabbi in Berlin, who fled to the United States and became a friend of Martin Luther King. I ended up writing a violin concerto about him instead. And I'm kind of, at the moment, I feel good about that because the story is told through music with no words, but it still is on my mind, actually. He's also related to my family.
Ofer, what cries out in Hebrew literature? Because it doesn't have to be Yiddish literature. It can be in any language.
Actually, I've been toying for many years with the idea of writing a Ladino opera. I don't think there is one.
I don't know of any.
And I have a few wonderful, wonderful stories, from the time of the expulsion from Spain, the Inquisition. But, good opera, it should have love, should have some death in it, and lots of good Jewish tunes. But, it's not a topic that you say it's a Jewish topic. You have to connect, the composer has to connect to the topic in a way that he tells you kishke to write about it. And there are many good stories if you're not attached to it immediately.
Anyone in particular that you...
Is
there anyone in particular that you're itching to write or to see some composer write an opera to?
Yes, there is one that's called the Trial of Andres Gonzalez. It's a real case that was in Toledo. and the guy was a Jewish. Actually, he was converted as a baby, became a priest. But all his life he knew that he's Jewish, and he actually was married in secret and had
that may be your next
they
opera.
had a baby together, and the woman lived in the monastery together with
That may
his,
be your next opera, and in Ladino no less. Ben and Alex, you know what my thing is. So, but apart from that, unless you've already decided to take my advice.
We're keeping a running list of all of the ideas, and
No, but if there's something that you really seriously think that cries out, whether you have to do it or someone else does it, Alex.
Well, we've been talking about this idea of the story of Der große Wörterbuch für die Jiddische Sprache, the great dictionary of the great unfinished dictionary of the Yiddish language that Udall Mark worked on for decades. It's a fascinating story. You know, it's got the tragedy of the dictionary being unfinished. That is crying out, you know, as a topic to us at this time. But really, you know, there are so many amazing stories, and I really agree with Ofer. What it comes down to at the end of the day is the story has to grab you as a story that needs to be told more than anything else. You know, more than, yeah. Sorry,
David, I'll let you go last, and then I'll tell you what I want.
Well, I'll keep it short. There's nothing. Just bouncing off what Bruce said, I think in my own work, I've found ways of dealing with Jewish material unoperatically. I have pieces based, if you'll consider this Jewish material, on Lenny Bruce routines, on Mort Saul routines. They're not operas, but they're something. I don't know exactly what. But, you know, before we hear your idea, what, Shtisel, the opera? I think it's bound to happen, right?
All right,
well,
well,
an instant classic.
Here is, many people know that I've been carrying on about this for 25 years. Chaim Grada's short novel, Diaguna. If there was ever an operatic subject, if there was ever a story that the opera is built into it, that's it. So if you all want to do that, that's okay, because we were talking before we started that there are 4 or 5 La Bohemes, not just Puccini's, and there are other Traviatas that weren't as successful and so forth. So we don't have to decide that only one does it.
Well,
Parrots,
if we write a scene, we could be done much quicker.
yeah, do it.
Great point, Bruce.
Parrots, there are many stories, but there are 2 in particular. Each has had many cantatas and oratorios, but no opera. One is Bunche Schweig, many of you know that, and the other is Oibnet Dochecher, if not higher. Many cantatas, many oratorios, but it could be definitely an opera, because you, of course, can add elements. You can add a romantic element. I mean, that would be plausible. The test is not whether it's true, the test is whether it's plausible. Uriel Acosta, we don't have time to go into who he was, but I mean that there are important plays about Uriel Acosta, who was a kind of Spinoza figure, pre-Spinoza figure in Amsterdam, and was excommunicated, and eventually, it's generally believed, committed suicide. Chana Senich, normally I would say stay away from the Holocaust, from 2 things. From the Holocaust, because it is not a good identifier of Jewishness. But Chana Senich is a special case. And the other topic I personally would say stay away from is Kabbalah. The true story of Eduardo Mortera, who was the last case where a Jewish child was kidnapped legally in Italy on orders of the Pope Pius IX, and because a maid had him baptized secretly when he was a year old. This is a fantastic story for opera. There are Agnon stories. Ofer, you know more about that than I do, but there are more Sholem Aleichem stories. There's the Mendel Bayless trial, the trial for the blood libel, as recently as the 20th century in Russia. There's the story of Eli Cohen. I think Ofer, am I correct? Eli Cohen, the spy who was executed in Syria. Israel. Yeah. I mean, and we could go on and on and on, but that's just a small handful of topics. So the bottom line is, Bruce and you and I were talking about this, that an opera composer needs a commission. I'm not going to spend all that time, and the commission needs to.
Wait, I have to say, when I wrote those two operas for the Y, I wasn't paid anything.
No, but from now on, you're not going to write.
Depends how old you are.
Yeah.
At this point in my life, I would need a commission even to rewrite Mikhoyels.
And a guaranteed performance. But we're
Yeah,
not talking.
it depends on the situation.
We're not talking about more than $500,000, and there is no reason that.
Really?
Yeah, right. If you keep the orchestra to that size, to 14 or whatever, what was it?
Talking about the production. Yeah.
Whatever. It is possible. We've talked about this. It is possible to have every year an opera commissioned on a Jewish subject, and the money is in the United States there to do it. And we should push for that, because my list could go on and on and on. And each of you, if you thought about it, would come up with things that you've read that I don't know. And we would have an entire genre of opera of Jewish substance in all these different musical styles, which is why I wanted everyone to hear the difference between David's 1 minute and Alex's, and so forth and so on. And I think that worked. So I think we're going to wrap up and take a few questions, and I will just, I suppose, quote somebody who, a famous newscaster, and say, good night and good luck with opera of Jewish experience. Alex, where are we going to go from here?
Sure, yeah. So we're basically at the hour here. So maybe we'll take one question officially. We'll call the program to an end, but we can continue to chat informally for those that want to stay after that part for that. But so here's just one kind of one official question to close with. As composers, how do you evoke Jewishness in music without reiterating musical tropes or invoking or perpetuating conventions? This is kind of what Neil was, getting at with the different styles. So maybe we can just speak about that for a minute from everyone's perspective. How does your musical language engage or not engage with the idea of Jewishness?
I mean, I think
I'll talk first
you
and
all
give
have to
everybody
think
else.
about is, does it have to?
I'll give everyone else time to think. But basically, first of all, any style of music at all has tropes and conventions. So being an expressive composer with some sense of authenticity, forget originality, whatever, it always takes a kind of wrestling with the conventions and the traditions of any musical language. And there is no such thing as a language that has nothing to do with music history. So the question if you leave out Jewish, you've got the same question. How do you write a decent piece of music that is not dealing with conventions and tropes? However, to make it Jewish, to be more specific, there's vocabulary that can be removed from the conventions. There are modes, there are rhythms, there's a kind of essence in whether it's a spirituality or an energy that relates to Jewishness. But the main thing is that you don't consciously, I hope, if you're writing something Jewish, don't consciously have to ask those questions, because it should be part of when you're writing a real piece of music as an experienced composer, it should be part of the inflection of how you think. It should be part of who you are, so that you're not wrestling with the basics.
I mean, I think what you just said describes Moses and Aaron of Schoenberg. I mean, he was being Schoenberg. And nothing could be more Judaic on a deep level philosophically of what he was, of that with which he was wrestling, because it's the libretto as well as the opera, as you all know. But it's pure who he was as a composer in terms of Schoenberg.
I mean, you always have to write the music that you should be writing. And if you have to think about it that way, you shouldn't be doing that. I'm so happy that David Schiff looks like he liked what I said and agrees with me. It makes me feel really good. I want to say one thing that's not a answer to a question, but the reason that I felt like I wanted to write Jewish opera was because of Gimpel. I went to see that. First, I saw it at Juilliard when it was in Paul Hall stage. It was just a couple of scenes. Then I went to see it, and I had been asked to think about writing an opera for the Jewish opera at the Y. And I don't want to say what it was, but I saw something else that they did, and I was thinking no. And then I saw Gimpel, and I thought, okay, I like this idea. I think I'll do that. So thanks, David. And also at the beginning, can you remind everyone what it was at the beginning? You said the opera's in Yiddish. If you don't speak Yiddish, what was it?
Oh, well,
Be quiet or something?
yeah. No, I mean, that was kind of ingenious of David.
What was that, David? Do you remember what you said?
No.
The idea was that there was one character, the Badchen, and the Badchen, as you know, in Eastern Europe, I mean, this all has to do with Eastern European Jewry, not other Jewries, not German-speaking Jewry, not Yemenite Jewry, not Persian Jewry. Okay, so we're speaking of one Jewry, although it is true that, let's say, in the year 1890, it is estimated that as high as 90 or higher % of the entire Jewish population of the world spoke Yiddish, even in the year 1900, as their primary language, because the other Jewries were simply smaller in terms of number of population. But the ingenious thing was to take a Badchen, who's an entertainer, basically a wedding entertainer, a jester, and have him speak in English, where the rest of the opera is sung in Yiddish. And so any intelligent audience that did not know one word of Yiddish could have understood the entire performance of Gimpel. I remember that. Well, in answer to that question, anyone else? Ofer, Alex?
I would just second whatever Bruce was saying. That's you know, as composers, as we age and go along, we resonate the kind of music that's inside us, and this is what we grew up with. I listen to Israeli music and Jewish music and Chazanut, and also I listen to Beethoven and Brahms and Mahler, and all of it is becoming the total sum of what I have to offer when I'm not sitting and just separating them, but I'm just, when I write, I know that they're all there, and the Jewish elements are definitely strongly there. So I don't need that it takes a lot of effort to make something Jewish or not Jewish. And by the way, I also remember that I contacted you, David, when I started writing Fool's Paradise for my doctoral degree. And I asked you, how did you do that? And how did you deal with the rights? Because rights was the biggest thing. And by the way, that is the reason that I wrote the Dybbuk later, because I didn't need that. They were all already gone. Bialik and Ansky.
And look, rights are a problem.
Public domain. I made it cheap.
Probably nobody except his family knows this, but Hugo Weisskopf, whose opera Esther at New York City Opera, what was it, 93, I think, yeah? It was the world premiere, which was acclaimed by serious, knowledgeable critics as the greatest American opera, interesting American opera, which it was in the post-war era. But it was 100% from Judaic perspectives of Megillat Esther, of the Book of Esther. But he started knowing that he wanted to write an opera of Jewish content, and that's all. And then he asked for advice, and it was a fellow professor of ours at JTS who said, "Well, how about Esther? That has built-in possibilities, especially if you go to what the Talmud says in terms of commentary about it and so forth." But he always wanted to write, and he never got to do it. His next opera, he wanted to be The Wall by Lampel. Is that the name? It's the very about the Warsaw Ghetto. It's the very first book ever written after the war about. I think it's Lampel, The Wall. Anyway, he couldn't get the rights, and that's why we don't have an opera.
Well, we certainly could talk about Jewish opera for all night, and maybe we'll informally chat a little bit more, but I just want to say thank you all so much, Neil, Bruce, David, Ofer, Ben. Thank you so much for being a part of this wonderful panel. There's so much more to discuss, and I look forward to continuing this discussion in the future. And thank you everyone that joined tonight, and we'd love to see you again soon, so come back to another program.
And next time on the stage at YIVO in person.
Absolutely.